So now let's talk about some of the objectives and characteristics and risks of samples. So the characteristics of a good sample. You've got a population. What are you looking at? Are you looking at a control test? Are you looking at a process? Are you looking at account transactions? In our example, we will look at 12,000 invoices. Therefore, the list of invoices will be our population for this example. You need to make sure you have a complete population. On all the records for the sample selection process related to the area being tested. One time a client gave me $32 million worth of records, just hundreds of thousands of records. And when I went out there, I did both the vouching and the tracing, which now you know what that means, and found out I didn't have everything. So come to find out that they had given me a file of this particular vendor I was looking at, and they actually had another vendor number or another vendor name in the system that they didn't give me that data. It was another 8 million records, or $8 million worth of records, I should say. So that made a big difference. So you want to make sure that you have a complete population of the data that you're going to be sampling. Next characteristic is the size of the sample. There must be a sufficient enough size so that you can rely on that data. There are statistical models out there to make sure that you grab enough of these samples of the entire population so that you can deliver that 95% confidence level that is reflective of the population. The next important piece of this is the sample selection. Samples should be representative of the population without bias. Okay, so don't just take the first 20 transactions. Don't take just the customers Don't take the smallest ones because they're easier. You want it to be unbiased. If you're a forensic auditor, you may build some bias into your sample to ensure that the issues you're investigating are covered. We call that an educated sample. But in general, when you're doing a financial sample, you want it to be random or unbiased. So set and meet tolerable error rates to ensure that the confidence in the sample and the attributes being tested so we can make reliable conclusions. So if you want a good sample evaluation, you should understand what your tolerable error is. So let's say you pick 30 items, and if you have 2 items that are bad, that tells you you don't know if you can really trust that sample size, or it really shows you that there might be a big problem with the overall population. So you might expand your sample, add some more items in there to see if the next few items that we test also have a problem. Because if that starts to show itself, now we are very concerned about the population that we've got and the issues we've got. But if we do our 30 sample and that wound up being the right sample size and it winds up being okay, then we can make a very accurate and reliable sample evaluation. So now let's talk about some of the risks associated with a sample. So the types of risks associated with a sample are: the auditor used a sample that was not representative of the population. So you didn't quite grab data that really reflected the entire population and either how it was sampled, how it was pulled out. Or there's a non-sampling risk where the auditor did not appropriately carry out the audit procedure or inappropriately diagnosed the problems. So let's say you don't know how to multiply out an invoice price, quantity times unit price, but maybe there was a unit of measure in there that you were confused on, so you wound up making a bad assumption based on that risk. That would be kind of the auditor's fault, or a non-sampling risk. The sample was good, I just didn't do a good job at it. So let's look at sampling risk a little bit further though. So sampling risk, that an auditor's conclusion based on a sample might be different from the conclusion that would be reached if they were able to test the entire population. So the risk of an incorrect acceptance, right? Risk of incorrectly accepting your result or your evaluation of that sample. Our sample would lead us to think that all 12,000 invoices were processed correctly when there are significant material issues that were missed by our sample. That's also known as audit ineffectiveness. So we have internal controls out there, and because we've now said that, geez, everything works really good, we can trust that invoicing system, we're going to have that risk of over-reliance or assessing that control risk too low. So if we assess it too low, that means we're thinking, oh, we're not going to detect anything, so we'll have a higher detection risk which means we'll lower our audit testing procedures or our substantive tests, which means we might miss some material misstatement. So that's the risk of incorrect acceptance. So now the risk of incorrect rejection. Our sample leads us to think the process for creating invoices is materially flawed and unreliable when the errors within the entire population would have been acceptable. So we're saying, oh, this invoicing system doesn't work at all. Based on our sample, it's bad, when actually maybe we were doing something wrong. So there's an audit inefficiency in there. Or maybe our conclusion, we just grabbed the 2 invoices that were done wrong out of the 12,000. They just happened to make our sample. So there's audit inefficiency, because what we're going to do is say that the internal controls aren't good enough. And so we'll have a risk of under-reliance, which means we'll think that the control is too high, which means we want a low detection problem, which means we're going to spend a lot of time doing substantive tests on something that's actually going to ultimately come out and say, well, it actually was pretty good, so we just were inefficient in our audit process. So that is the sampling risks. And that concludes our discussion on characteristics and risks of samples.